coming. Hear my train coming.
Anywhere that you need to go in town, you have to pass the track.
The first railroad in the 1850s wasn't coming directly to Muncie. It happened to be going past Muncie. It was building from Indianapolis to Cleveland, and Muncie was on the way. The interesting thing is that Muncie was already here. The original core of it, the downtown and the Gilbert neighborhood, that's already in place. And when the tracks came along, they didn't want to build through expensive real estate through town, so they built just past the southern edge of town. So our first set of tracks come past town. They're not heading for Muncie per se. And the second set of tracks, built right after the Civil War, they're coming from the south, from Cincinnati up to Fort Wayne. They come up along the eastern edge of what was then the original plat of Muncie. Turned out to be the middle of Madison Street. And so for 75 years, we had a through rail line coming up the middle of the street, up Madison Street. And then several other rail lines were added later, but they all tended to sort of build into the same corridors that had been set up by those first two. So once the rail lines are here, they become the logical place to put industries. Larger manufacturers, and the Ball brothers are the classic example, they were lured to Muncie by the promise of inexpensive natural gas and by the offer of large tracts of land. So they could build a large state-of-the-art factory. You don't do that in an existing area, so you go out to the edge. So they went south of existing Muncie, bought land down accessible to the rail lines. Muncie was never a railroad town per se. As the town grew, it logically grew across the tracks. Now, when that first rail line came through, there was no town south of the tracks. It was out in the country. But then as the town grew, during the natural gas boom era, it had to grow somewhere. If you were affluent, you grew away from the tracks. If you were employed in industry, you sort of grew down around the general complex of rail lines and factories. Housing north of the tracks is different from housing south of it. And the tracks, once they were there, they were a nuisance. They're smoke, noise, dirt, and so if you can afford to, you don't want to live next to them. So the bigger houses tend to move away from the tracks. They move into the Emily Kimbrough neighborhood, they move north across the river, then they move northwest across the river to the area that becomes Ball State. Bigger houses north. The housing to the south is more oriented to the industry. It's built for people who are working in the factories, and it's built to be worker housing, and they don't have much of a choice. If they're going to work at the factories are on the rail lines. They've got to live in reasonable proximity because in an early day they were walking, and that limited where they could go. So I think that's the railroads and some other things working together to create a social difference.
You know, I think the South Side people were marginalized by, it's where the industry was in this town initially because of the railroad, because of the Balls, because of factories being on that railroad that did bring commerce here. And then all of the South Side's sort of part of town were people that worked in the factories. And they were all sort of, you know, working class houses. And when that dried up, it pretty much decimated that part of town. So, you know, the railroad, as far as the tracks being sort of a dividing line through town, that's a real, kind of a real thing. And by further decimating the idea of a central square in the downtown, and then making up for that by Walnut Street being one strip that goes down, and then when it gets to the railroad tracks, there's a roundabout. So, oh God, if you get that far, you don't want to go any further, just turn around and come back. I mean, hell, they might have as well built the Berlin Wall down there saying, okay, This is no man's land down here.
It has its inconvenient moments, especially here on the south side. One train can block more than 2 or 3 roads, and trying to find an alternate route, you have to drive pretty far out of your way sometimes. It can be a hindrance because most of the tracks are on this side of town, and the people on the north side of town don't have to deal with it as much because basically the only one they have to deal with is out by the mall. So we're the ones with all the compacted railways.
I don't believe in single causations, I guess. I don't think that because the railroads are here, everything else is here. As I said, part of Muncie was here first, then the railroad came through. It's sort of an incremental process, people making individual decisions that build on earlier decisions. Muncie is not an example of a grand master plan.
Well, I hear my train a coming.